everyone, this is Tyla from the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, and you're watching the Constitution at Work podcast, the series for people interested in constitutional matters and transformation in South Africa. Today, I'm joined by Dave Steward, Chairperson of the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, to unpack the State of the Nation address we heard last night. Now, Dave, we just attended a Mail and Guardian debrief session on the event. Most of the opinions on the SONA weren't that great. We weren't very optimistic, quite pessimistic, if anything, with Professor Richard Cullen saying that this was one of the worst SONA addresses he's heard. What are your thoughts?
Well, somebody else at the Mail and Guardian seminar said that the president was speaking as though this was the first time he'd appeared on the scene. He's been responsible for the situation that has arisen after 25 years of democratic governance. This is a problem created by the government. And now, in order to address the problem, the government wants to declare a national state of disaster and to seize all sorts of undetermined powers for itself to clean up the mess that it itself has created.
So let's stop right there, because I think as much as we don't want to focus on SONA in relation to Eskom and the state of disaster, it resoundingly brings most of the public back to what we saw under COVID-19 state of disaster, where there was massive looting, mismanagement, and the public came out feeling like they can't trust this current government. What do you think the thinking is around this state of disaster? Is it going to succeed in ending load shedding as we have been promised?
Well, first of all, Tyler, the bill, the National Disaster Management Act, is an aberration. How it got through constitutional scrutiny, I don't know, because it goes far further than a state of emergency. A state of emergency is supposed to be the biggest limitation of human rights that is permissible under our Constitution. But it can be declared only by Parliament, with the approval of Parliament, in circumstances where the life of the country, the security of the people is gravely at risk. Now, along comes the Disaster Management Act, and the requirements for declaration of a state of disaster are incredibly broad, and they are incredibly vague. You can have a state of disaster declared for virtually almost anything where the state or the government doesn't have the ability to resolve the problem with its existing resources. But the government hasn't had the ability to resolve many problems with its existing resources. Does this mean that there must be a state of disaster every time it has a delivery crisis? It's crazy. And the other thing, too, is that the state of disaster can be renewed by the minister without any approval of Parliament after 3 months, and then forever, month after month after month. And there's no limitation on the degree to which the regulations promulgated under the national state of disaster can affect fundamental human rights. As we saw during the COVID crisis, regulations were used that really limited a whole range of fundamental human rights, including the right to association, the right to education, religious rights, a whole array of rights. So in terms of a national state of emergency, the national state of emergency can be renewed only for 21 days by Parliament. Thereafter, with a majority vote in Parliament, it can be renewed for another 3 months. But after that, it can be renewed only with a 60% majority in Parliament. So here you have a carefully drafted provision, and a foundational provision in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which protects basic rights and which ensures the continuing supremacy of Parliament, oversight function for Parliament on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have this crazy law which does away with all of that. So this is a huge problem for us right now.
And as you say, with the state of emergency, it wouldn't apply, that is founded in the Constitution, it wouldn't apply to crisis or emergencies that are created by your own volition. So what we're seeing with the Disaster Management Act, with the state of disaster, is government creating an issue where they're now going to throw resources at a new type of ministerial department that is going to focus exclusively on the electricity crisis. But they've been able to handle this electricity crisis now for 20 years and they've done nothing. So we're not going to see any changes to the actual resources and the actual structure in terms of how they're going to manage the crisis. What I did want to ask, though, in terms of the state of disaster, is that Ramaphosa has said that he is going to be making sure that the Auditor General works closely with the Minister of Electricity, with this committee, to lead the response to the crisis. Will the Auditor General's supervision allow the public to trust this type of entity more, allow the public to trust this state of disaster more? Will it lead to the accountability that we need in government?
No, that's why we need parliamentary oversight. It's not good enough just for the Auditor General to be satisfied, because he deals with the finances of the state and accountability in that respect. But what about human rights? The Auditor General doesn't have any role in determining the degree to which a state of disaster is going to affect human rights. That's Parliament's job. And that's why it is an aberration to have this kind of intrusion into fundamental rights with no approval of Parliament. It is irreconcilable with the foundational principles in our Constitution.
So one of the speakers mentioned in this Mail and Guardian debrief today that the presidency is basically creating more ministers within his presidency who won't have to account to Parliament. And that's setting quite a dangerous precedent, because although we might have President Ramaphosa today, we don't know who might be in that office in years to come. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, listening to President Ramaphosa, all South Africans of goodwill will agree that we need to take concerted action to address the energy crisis. In fact, we should have been doing this for the last 20 years. Now, now that we've woken up to it, and don't forget, this was the same sort of thing he said at the last SONA and the SONA before that. We really, really need to take the steps that should have been taken a long time ago to address the energy crisis, to ensure accountability at Eskom, to ensure proper maintenance, to make sure that there's proper management, that human resources are there, that experts are there, but it hasn't been happening till now. Now, if President Ramaphosa can do that, that will be wonderful, but he can do that with the powers he already has in terms of the Constitution. He doesn't need a national state of disaster to do that.
So many are in agreement with you. In fact, the DA and Solidarity have said they will take this decision to the courts to challenge it. Do you think that that application will be successful? Do you think that this is something that will be challenged, or are we going to see government continue to push these types of forums and these types of committees that we really aren't asking for?
I think that a challenge to the National Disaster Act in the highest court of the country has a very good chance of success, because nobody who understands English can read the text of the National Disaster Management Act on the one hand and the Constitution on the other, and say that the National Disaster Management Act is in any way acceptable. And there's something that we have to think about here. Why is this happening? Why is President Ramaphosa not using his substantial powers as president to deal with this crisis? This arises. I'm sure this is something that was dealt with at the meeting of the ANC's National Executive Committee at the end of last month. And they issued a statement in which they encouraged President Ramaphosa to declare this national state of disaster. But maybe there was another disaster they were thinking about, and that is the disaster for many of them and their colleagues if the ANC loses power at their next election. And at the same weekend, there were polls suggesting that support for the ANC might have dropped below 40%. So these are the two disasters that the NEC was considering. First of all, the energy crisis disaster, but then the possibility that they might lose power in a democratic election. And the big question is, for which disaster is the National Disaster Management Act being invoked?
Definitely, and I
so,
think
this is in the run-up to the most important election we are going to have in South Africa since 1994. And how is that election going to work fairly if it is under the control of regulations issued by the Office of the President? We haven't seen the regulations, but we must look at them and watch them very, very carefully to make sure that there is no abuse of the National Disaster Management Act in this process.
Definitely, and we will be monitoring those regulations and providing some of that information to our constituents. I just wanted to go back to your points about whether this is a state of disaster to deal with Eskom or whether this is a state of disaster to buy the ANC time to the 2024 elections. Now, noting the fact that the Disaster Management Act, like you say, is so easy to keep postponing the end of the state of disaster. Exactly like you say, there's no parliamentary oversight. Is that what this is? Is it to buy time? Are we not going to see any changes? Because, I mean, we're hearing promises. We're hearing 10, 12-month, 18-month plans, which are just so coincidentally in line with the election that we're going to be holding. So is this empty promises?
To start with, as we've already agreed, the national state of disaster should never have been declared to manage this crisis, this serious crisis, because the government already possesses all of the powers it needs to achieve this purpose. So the question must arise, why a national state of disaster at this stage, and what impact might that have on electioneering in the critical period that lies ahead?
Thank you, Dave. And then I know we've only focused on the Eskom state of disaster, but that wasn't the only thing that was covered in the SONA address. We were waiting to hear what would be said about this tourism Tottenham deal, which seems to have fallen by the wayside, thank goodness. But we were also hearing the plans on social security, social income grants, with promises again to once again extend the social income grants, but no real strategy on where that funding is going to be coming from. So my question is, in terms of the economy, of course, which is reliant on ending load shedding, in terms of job creation, which again is reliant on having functioning power and having an economy that can rely on that, will we see any short-term strategy around the provision of a more stable, supportive economy for business or private individuals?
Well, Tyler, you can't do this sort of thing piecemeal. You can't on the one hand say that we're going to attract hundreds of billions of rands in investment, and then on the other hand proceed with the expropriation bill. The expropriation bill will chase away investors. You can't say on the one hand, oh, we have a social compact, we want to work with business, we want to attract businesses to South Africa, and then on the other hand, have the new Employment Equity Bill Act, which will give the government the right to interfere with crucial question of appointing staff at every level on a racial basis. You can't have, the idea of being open to the successful free market economies in the world, United States, Western Europe, Australasia, and on the other hand, keep on tilting toward regimes overseas that are totalitarian, as we're seeing now. So what we need is consistency. We need an approach to government that will work, and that's not what we're getting. Strangely enough, the National Development Plan, which President Ramaphosa himself was involved with in 2011 and 2012, presented a coherent program for governance, for addressing unemployment, for addressing education problems, but it hasn't been implemented. That is the problem. There's no shortage of solutions to the problems of South Africa. There's a shortage of the ability to implement. There's a shortage of integrity, as we've seen during the state capture crisis. So we hope that President Ramaphosa will be able to succeed with his program, with many of these goals that he set out, how to address the energy crisis. But we've heard it before. We really, really, really hope that he will be successful, but not at the price of undermining our constitutional democracy.
And I think this next question is then just to unpack what you've said a little bit more for those in our audience who maybe haven't kept up to date with everything that's transpired pre-SONA, but specifically looking at things like the Employment Equity Act, things that are classified as red tape, barriers to the government solving some of these issues, which the state of disaster will allow the government to disregard. That's the thinking, is that they won't have to comply with ratios or quotas when they are choosing specific people. They won't have to comply with the Employment Equity Act, for example. They'll be able to cut the red tape and look at how they can solve the problem. But it begs the question, and this really is, like I say, to those in the audience who haven't been keeping up with everything, why is that red tape there? If they need to do a state of disaster to cut it away to fix the problem, why do we have it then?
The red tape comes from the underlying ideology. That is the problem. That is one of the fundamental problems. That is one of the problems. The other problem has been the integrity problem. But once again, President Ramaphosa spoke about the need to combat corruption, the need to combat state capture. But he knows that many of his colleagues and the National Executive Committee have been compromised, and they've been mentioned in the Zondo Commission. So once again, you have this divergence between rhetoric and reality.
So I think the last question I have, because it is a burning question on everyone's mind who listened to the SONA address last night, is who do you place as the Minister of Electricity? Who do you expect to be appointed in that role?
That's the $64,000 question. And I think Richard Cannon said that he'd given up a long time ago trying to predict who would be appointed to the cabinet. And I think that's a very wise precedent. Let's wait and see.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Constitution at Work. Remember to like and subscribe to keep updated with our latest news. You can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter at FW de Klerk Foundation. Thanks.